All right, I think the recording is already up. When you have Prime Minister.
Hi, am I still audible?
Still audible.
Okay. Again, I put few eyes in the chat. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. So we think the problem in status quo is that rich MNCs pay no or very little corporate tax in a lot of countries and just enrich their shareholders at the expense of the country's population, right? We think that this is bad. First of all, in the MEDCs that are often their home countries in the first place, but second of all, particularly bad in LADCs where these MNCs often outsource their operations because of factors such as the lower cost of labor. We think that our stance in Gulf is clear. We prefer a world where countries adopt this as a policy and where this is universally adopted by all countries. We think that to clarify, this debate is not about how we would get a global mandate for doing this. We think that we support the adoption of this policy, and that is our burden in this debate. So two things in this speech: how this is principally just and practically furthers the development of countries. Second, how this changes the incentives of governments, particularly of LEDCs, with regards to how they attract companies, which also hugely benefits the population. So first, right, how is this principally just and has huge practical benefits in terms of furthering these countries' development? Let's look at the problem in status quo, right? We think that many MNCs pay no or very little corporate taxes. The money instead is simply hoarded by shareholders or by wealthy CEOs. We think that this is principally bad, first of all, because it perpetuates wealth inequality. It fails to contribute to contribute to the countries that provide these companies with the infrastructure that they need to be able to operate, right? But we think this is especially bad in LEDCs where these MNCs often just outsource there for a lower labor cost. But because of the lack of corporate taxes that they pay, they simply operate in a very exploitative way and don't actually give back to the country or further economic development, right? Why is a global minimum tax principally just as well as hugely practically beneficial on our side, right? What happens now that we have it? We think on the first level, this is principally just for two reasons. First, because these corporations benefit from the state infrastructure and should pay taxes. For this, we think that particularly in the status quo, there is a huge imbalance of power for LDs, especially who need to attract this investment, which causes them to be unable in the status quo to demand the tax levels that would actually be just. We think that a global minimum tax would remedy this. But second of all, also, we think that this is simply part of the state's responsibility to the people, right? It's part of the duty of care of the state that the state should demand what is fair from MNCs and not allow exploitation. But on a practical level, right, how does this actually achieve huge benefits for development and for the well-being of these countries' populations? We think that this tax and the hugely increased amount of collective tax revenue that will now go to these governments from the various MNCs who would all be subject to this tax can be used for hugely beneficial purposes of redistribution, right? Things like welfare, social security, as well as things like infrastructure, education, healthcare, development, and so on and so forth. This is a massive benefit and massive utility that we have on Gulf. We think that this would hugely reduce inequality as well as hugely improve the lives of millions of people, right? And obviously, because we think in our world, this tax would be a universal one that is global in nature. These companies can't just avoid it by going elsewhere, right? But I think this is especially important in LEDCs because we think that these LEDCs are ultimately are exposed to the worst in status quo and need this money the most, right? I'll take the POI in a short while. So a quick clarification here. We think that companies are still likely to outsource their operations to these LEDCs because other advantages that these LEDCs have, like lower cost of labor and resources and so on, would still be there, right? So let's just preempt any attacks that, oh, now these companies won't invest in these LEDCs at all, right? However, they now have to outsource responsibly and pay their 15% dues to the government, right? This is hugely useful for development of the country and in general, the ability of the country to uplift its people, right? And another quick clarification here, we think that LADCs in general would have the incentive to set the tax rate at 15% because based on the motion clarification, if they only set 7%, for example, the remaining 8% would just be paid to the home country of the MNC, and we think that these governments don't have the incentive to allow this. So okay, right? On the second thing on how this changes the incentive for governments for how they attract companies, but before that, I'll take the POI.
So presumably things like welfare and infrastructure, if they are hugely beneficial, why then have countries historically allowed setting a diverse range of tax rates according to their own needs?
We think that, like I have said, and like I will elaborate on later, LADCs face huge pressure to attract these companies by offering a tax rate that is below the level that would actually be principally just because of the need to attract investment. We think that this is an issue that we solve on our side. So okay, right, moving on. How do we change government's incentives? We think that the status quo is that many LADCs try to attract MNCs to invest in them by offering a tax rate that is either very, very low or that is just 0%, right? Because there are still other benefits that they get, like local employment, for example, when these MNCs come. This means then that there is a race to the bottom for these LADCs to just offer extremely low tax rates or just no tax rates, which creates a vicious cycle, right? This means that the tax rate becomes the main metric that companies use when they decide where to invest, as opposed to other things like the availability of transportation, infrastructure, and so on and so forth, right? We think that what happens now is that companies say, this country is offering me a 0% tax rate. It doesn't matter if this country that doesn't yet have infrastructure or doesn't yet have a developed transport system, because I can just use the money that I keep to set one up myself in the areas where I am operating, right? So this means that the governments of LADCs don't have the incentive to prioritize setting up infrastructure and transport and so on, because the main way they attract these companies is through a low tax rate, right? What happens now that all these LADCs demand 15%? Companies are going to change their metrics and are going to say to themselves, I'm not going to pay 15% and have to set up my own transport system, right? So which means that the way that these countries compete becomes about ensuring that the country has good conditions for these MNCs to operate in the first place, right? So setting up things like infrastructure, transport, and so on. And crucially, this also benefits everyone, because unlike the limited transport system that these MNCs would set up in the areas where they operate, the governments have the incentive to set up these transport systems and infrastructure and so on evenly across the entire country, including in regions where these MNCs are not directly operating, right? So on our side, the race to the bottom is stopped, and other metrics such as infrastructure and development become the main metric through which these LADCs compete to attract companies, which has huge knock-on benefits for the populations of these countries as a whole. We think that you should go with Gulf.
Thank you, PM. Now let's have the leader of opposition.
Just to check, am I audible?
You're audible.
Okay. POIs to begin verbally, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. When corporate tax was the very thing that allowed developing countries to economically enfranchise themselves, but now under a global minimum tax, you took away that tool of prosperity from them. You say that is the worst thing you could do to the stakeholder you wanted to help so much. What exactly then do we support on the side of opposition before I get into a few pieces of responses? Number one, we don't support the adoption of the global minimum tax. 2, we prefer the status quo where countries have the agency to set the level of minimum corporate tax they want based on local conditions in that country. Thirdly, I think countries are still going to be smart when it comes to setting their corporate tax. So for instance, governments are going to consult economic technocrats and then conduct things like surveys on the ground to determine the level of corporate tax that would be befitting for conditions in the status quo. With that being said, a few pieces of response to the speaker before me. Number one, regarding their model, I don't think proposition can take a soft stance and say that they're just going to defend the concept in abstract. Because if you're going to argue practical benefits, you need to give me a mechanism of change as to how exactly you're going to implement this corporate tax. So I think if you want to defend the merits of the policies I just said, there needs to be a mechanism to illustrate how exactly you're going to facilitate the adoption of this global minimum tax. Secondly, I think if they want effectivity, no, they can't just assert to you that developing countries want to increase the rates of corporate tax, I think these are the very same countries who want to keep their rates of tax low so they can attract FDI. I think what you're going to need to do on the side of prop is you're going to need to force every single country to adopt this global minimum tax policy. Otherwise, your profits are just going to be shipped off to the West and you are not going to prosper. Second, I think their whole principle of justification is just alarming because they assert to you that corporations are malevolent and abuse workers. One, I'd like to note that a majority of the MNCs are actually the ones who facilitate things like technological transfer and actually help to build infrastructure in these LEDCs, because previously the government was too poor and they didn't have the necessary amount of funds to do these things. I think regarding power asymmetry, the very thing that actually hands power within the governments of these LEDCs is actually having the choice to be able to determine the level of corporate tax rate you want. Because I'm now allowed to choose the level of corporate tax rate I have, that is what I'm able to use as a bartering chip to attract MNCs into my country and invest. Thirdly, I think the whole duty of the state is rather ironic on prop because it should be protecting your people based on local conditions, not just buying into a blanket policy that ignores the nuances of your own economy. The biggest principle just thing you could let a country do is choose the kind of economic policy they want that actually fits the kinds of conditions at home. Thirdly, regarding wealth redistribution, I think this is a concession that countries are going to be taxed at a very high rate, which means that if you're going to increase the cost of life, I think it's going to be harder to fund things like welfare programs when MNCs aren't interested in investing in your country anymore because the costs of production are too high. Finally, they assert that other cost-effective incentives will remain. I'd like to note at the top of this response that it doesn't mean that if you have lower cost of labor, that means your costs will just be lower in general, because it's offset by the higher corporate tax rate, which means that deregulation is still a bigger problem on the side of government. Because if you're no longer able to use corporate tax as a tool to attract countries, you're then forced to deregulate further to attract those very same countries who you could have done under the side of opposition. Before I get into my arguments, is there a point?
Yes, so on our side, we have the fiat that this will be global, and since it is global, these MNCs can't just go elsewhere, and so we still accrue all our benefits.
So I think I'm going to prove in argumentation how you actually make these MNCs become far more isolationist and how you localize production, which breaks down global supply chains. On to my first argument as to how nations ought to have agency to decide their economic policy. 3 layers here. 1, why is having sovereignty important in international trade? Because when we allow nations to decide what is good, it's because they should have choice to decide how the economy wants to be run. Sovereignty in international trade means we allow countries to decide what is good for them on their own terms. I like to note that the imposition of a global minimum tax is actually just neo-colonialism that's paraded as a facade, because the countries who are likely to support this global minimum tax are the Western liberal democracies who want to tax large pools of wealth. So they're going to pressure smaller countries to just adopt this policy anyway if you want to enjoy the so-called benefits from it. I think if you want your positive benefit government, you need to defend forcing countries to sign it, because there are bound to be LEDCs who want to have the lower corporate tax rate, but you strip them ability to do so. Secondly then, why do I think a global minimum tax isn't the best option for all countries? Because when countries are forced to abide by one economic policy, you reduce their ability to pick based on the conditions that fit them the most. Note, this policy only helps the developed countries who already have safety nets to rely on. So their biggest problem is just taxing wealth. The bigger problem we should be focusing on is the fact that these developing countries still need to develop, and the only way they can do that is if they have a low corporate tax rate. Why is this so? I think because they use low corporate tax as a means of survival. Why is this a legitimate choice? Because when developing nations were previously stripped of the ability to develop under colonialism, this is a double punishment. When you force them to do things like abide by a global minimum tax, and now I'm no longer able to reduce my corporate tax to increase FDI. Finally, why is having a low corporate tax important for developing countries? It's because they don't have that much ready infrastructure available, but what you can do is attract corporations to come in and invest through a low corporate tax. Why is this so? 1, you have lower cost of production. 2, it's easy to set up businesses. And 3, it's profitable because you don't have that much of a tax. I think these developed countries just can't afford to keep their corporate tax low, because under government, they would lose out on this policy, which means that you will face a greater lag in development when you increase the cost of production and companies don't have that many funds available. Second argument then, as to how smaller developing countries suffer under this model. 3 layers. 1, why are the profit margins of these countries countries undercut because the industries within these countries like aren't really that profitable. So things like natural resource extraction, and they have just a low skilled population, and it's relatively cheap only because of these low corporate tax rates. I think a global minimum tax strips them of these profit margins because you can't argue for nations being able to just set a lower corporate tax rate and it will be offset by paying it back to your home country. Because one, this concedes that you're going to be shipping profits back to the home countries, which are developed nations, meaning that they're still going to be able to benefit off of this. But secondly, I think you worsen disparities in developing countries. We are no longer able to use this as a tool to attract FDI. So no, these countries still need to develop, but because you increase the minimum corporate tax rate, you aren't able to generate large profit margins to do things like hire lots of workers. So this is going to come at the cost of retrenching more poor workers when your costs of production are too high and you need to offset it. Finally, I think you just incentivize MNCs to just operate in their home countries. Why is this so? Because when the cost of production, like literally investing within developing countries, is too high, it would make much more sense to just operate in one country alone and make that my home base. Because if I'm going to have to do things like, if I can't afford to pay things like a lower corporate tax rate, I might as well not diversify. If you truly wanted what was best for developing countries, then you could only side with opposition.
Thank you, LO. Now let's have the DPM.
Hi, am I audible?
You're audible.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The first thing to point out is that this is not a policy debate. It's a supports the adoption debate. That means this isn't about how this policy manifests or what the specifics of getting this to happen is. It is, should we adopt it or not? So in the clash of should we adopt it or not, the question is, assuming that we can get a world where every country adopts this policy, would that be beneficial for the different stakeholders versus not? Considering that's the clash, a lot of the analysis that happened in that first op speech really makes no sense to this debate. So let me start by doing this and clarifying what this tax reform proposal is. Then we'll talk about a bunch of the rebuttals to what happened in that first op speech. And then I'm going to do a substantive on why developed states or home countries in this case have the duty and obligation to adopt this proposal. So what is this tax reform proposal? Home countries set a law that says 15% of tax of profits must be paid. So if the host country's tax rate is lower, whatever is not paid to the host country must be paid to the home country. So for instance, if Singapore set this law, when SIA sets up its manufacturing business or its catering business in Malaysia, Malaysia's tax rate is 10%. The remaining 5% goes to the Singaporean government because that is the law. The consequence is companies pay a fixed 15% regardless of where they invest or outsource to, which means the internal metrics of the company change to no longer caring about tax rates as a basis for where they invest, and that they will use other metrics to determine where they outsource and where they invest to. We'll come to that in a bit. Ariel did a bunch of this analysis that didn't get engaged with, but we'll talk about it in a bit more detail later. The result of this is that the host country will always set their tax rates at 15% or higher because they know that these companies will be spending that amount regardless, and they might as well take that profit for themselves. This is the amount that companies will pay out regardless. So why should we give away 5% to Singapore? As Malaysia, we can gain the full 15%. Therefore, we should set our tax rates at 15%. This means that LEDCs and other countries that are taking in MNCs are going to start setting their tax rates at a rate where they earn more money as an LEDC government because they can set a higher tax rate and are no longer using it as a basis for competition and can instead compete on other levels. Let's talk about rebuttals for a bunch of things that happened in that speech. The first thing is this weird claim about tool of prosperity for host countries, that countries will be smart in setting what their standards are for their own countries. That sounds great and idealistic and utopic, but it's not the reality that exists today, right? In competing to get MNCs in, LEDCs actually set 0% tax rates right now because it is attractive to companies. We've seen this in in numerous industries. We've seen this in a bunch of like oil and pharma and manufacturing industries where countries literally set their corporate tax rate at 0% because they think that it's competitive and it will bring these countries in. Hell, it even happens with developed countries, right? When Amazon was trying to set up a second HQ, every single American state tripped over each other to run to give Amazon lower and lower tax rates so that the HQ would be set up in their state instead of another state in the US. This is the reality of how tax rates are set. It is not based on need, it is not based on reason, it is not based on economic success, it is based on what is the lowest rate we can set so that we will win this internal competition from other countries. That means that countries are not smart in setting their tax rates right now, and we should remove this element of competition so that these LEDCs have the ability to earn some profit from the exploitation that comes from these MNCs being in that country. The second thing then is sovereignty, which is such a weird argument to run considering the info slide literally rebuts it for them, right? The info slide explicitly says countries still have the right to set whatever corporate tax rate they want, i.e. sovereignty. So it's unclear why there's suddenly a like forced decision to do this. The question is, how do we make sure people are paid their dues and that we have the ability to ensure that countries are paid fairly? When there's a global standard for what corporate tax rates should be, then countries will no longer undersell themselves to companies and will start giving rates that are fair to them. So yes, it is like a nudge in the right direction, but it's not sovereignty issue because countries still can decide, maybe I don't want to do 15%. I'm okay with America taking 2% or 1% of this, but I will still charge 13, 14%, whatever it is. The point is that countries now have a global average that they can benchmark their corporate tax to, which allows for them to make better decisions for themselves. We do this for a lot of things, right? We do this for environmental standards and carbon tax emissions. We do this for industry standards and pollution. We do this for gender quotas. Many countries have global standards that you then push countries into nudging into things that are better for their people. The last thing then is this reducing the ability to develop because low corporate tax rate is the method of survival. Yeah, literally the debate, bro. Why should this be the method of survival for countries is literally the question. Ariel gave you analysis for what other metrics should be the choice for how investments are done and how it changes incentives for industry and infrastructure development, that in the ability for these countries to develop and their ability to compete with each other, you need to prove that corporate tax rate absolutely should exclusively be the choice method of survival that countries have. We are saying there are other metrics that countries should use, like development, like infrastructure, like education, like healthcare, that are significantly better methods and metrics of competition than corporate tax rate. The entire point of the case in government is that we want to give these countries more money. OP admits that MNCs would still operate in LEDCs anyway because labor cost is cheaper, natural resources only exist in some of these countries. This means, and like the amount of first mover advantage you have in a new economy, a new industry, this means that you are always likely to have a situation where companies from developed countries are going to go into these LEDCs. We are creating a framework to make it better. So why do developed states have the duty and obligation to adopt this proposal? Corporations from their country are benefiting from the exploitation of the home country. And as a state, your duty is to make sure that people are not exploited, especially in your name, and that corporations pay their dues for what they take from the community. This sets an internal local precedence for companies because it, in terms of repaying the local communities in actually impactful ways, the alternative in status quo is that corporate social responsibility projects are often so superficial and incredibly posturing in nature, where it's tokenistic in terms of what companies do for their people. In the best case scenario outcome in our world, states would volunteer the top-up amount to the host country in the form of developmental or humanitarian aid. In the worst case scenario, we set a bar for how many companies need to pay for the output they get. That means more revenue for the home country to do right by its people. Either way, the home country sets a good corporate standard for their internal industries, regardless of which other country they invest in, that result in better treatment of people, and B, creates greater revenue for themselves and other countries at large. What this tax reform policy does is that it allows countries to set standards for companies on what correct and good behavior is and reduces the amount of exploitation that exists. We propose.
Thank you, DPM. Now let's have DLO.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yes.
All right. starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I just want to start at the top of the speech with a glaring contradiction from government's case, because they both claim that countries are really dumb and will make bad economic decisions and lower their tax rates to zero, but somehow when they want to encourage investment, they can build sprawling transport systems, they can develop so much infrastructure so that a country becomes a viable option for MNCs to develop into. I think if countries are so dumb on your side of the house that they will lower tax rates so much that it would detriment the people on the ground, I think what happens on your side when there's no more the ability to regulate your corporate tax rates, you're going to do things like loosening labor regulations to make things cheaper. It looks like not having a good minimum wage. It looks like having workers work in like overwhelmingly unhealthy and comfortable temperatures and environments. And these are all things that also cut corners and lower the tax rates, like loosening environmental regulations and etc. That is the kind of world you have to live in. I'm going to talk about two things in this speech before I introduce this third argument about how this hampers development. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the principle. I think that's really important of sovereignty in this debate. And secondly, I'm going to talk about development of third world countries. Firstly, then on the principle really quickly, I have two issues here. Number one, I think DPM likes you to assume that countries will make bad decisions based on, for example, whatever Amazon declares, whatever MNCs say, these countries will suddenly make irrational decisions and this will harm their countries. But I don't think this is necessarily a bad decision, right? Because they would like you to believe that a 0% tax rate is a bad thing. While that only happens in a minimum of cases, in most instances, the lower tax rates necessarily means employment for your people. It means people get food to put on their table because they're being employed, right? So even though you sacrifice your tax rates for the government, we think people on the ground, if they're being employed, that is a rational decision that countries should be able to undertake, and that is a meaningful decision that we shouldn't discount just because government thinks something else is a so-called better decision for these countries. I think only these countries can decide what is good for them, and given that their tax situations are far different from the Western or developed nations, we don't think it is an illegitimate choice. But secondly, we like to know that sovereignty only happens when the decision is a meaningful one. Insofar as DPM themselves already claims that it doesn't make a difference whether or not you set your tax rate at 5, 10, or 15% because the money will still be going elsewhere anyway. It's unclear as to what kind of autonomy you're granting these countries when the tax rate that they set doesn't even make a difference for whether or not people are going to invest into their countries. Which is to say, on our side of the house, we're able to protect the sovereignty of these countries. We think this is the most important thing in this debate, given that we shouldn't impose these kind of tax rates onto them, given that we've proven that it doesn't work. Secondly, then let's talk about the development of these nations then. A few things broadly, right? Number one, I think we'd like to note that attracting investors will be symmetrical on both sides of the house. So countries will inevitably require investments and FDI to develop. The difference is that how they do it. I think it's far too idealistic for government to say that they want countries with the most development. PM says that these countries will suddenly start to develop their transport systems and etc. So they have the best framework for MNCs to enter their countries. I think when PM says that these countries have low cost of labor and therefore they will already inherently incentivize other MNCs to invest, that is where they already concede. This looks like the deregulation of labor laws, right? This materially detriments the lives of the most vulnerable blue-collar workers on the ground and is inhumane, right? Because if we compare to what we sacrifice on our side of the house, if we sacrifice some tax revenue, we think at the very least it's far less risky to the people on the ground. If we're going to tell you about how these third world nations often have terrible government systems anyway, they're corrupt, they're bureaucratic, they don't have the capacities to properly develop, then what is most important is the material lives of the people on the ground. And when you deregulate environmental laws that cause harm to the environment, for example, you permanently damage the land so that people in the future will never be able to grow, or you poison the rivers and all of that so people die because of pollution and emissions. On your side of the house, that is where you're actually killing people, versus on our side of the house, what there are benefits of infrastructure or education based on tax revenue is all contingent on a functioning government model. And if that doesn't happen, we think our harms are far more likely to occur. They are some merely circumstantial, right? So we think this, if taxes are symmetrical, then they have to find other ways of incentivizing FDI to enter, and we think that other ways of incentivizing are far more harmful on their side of the house. So if, as government says, that these nations are so dumb, it's unclear as to how they're able to build extensive transport systems and everything to actually encourage people to come in. I'll take your PI later, right? But secondly, if we're talking about development through tax revenue, again, the premise of this assumes that you have an optimized government structure to begin with. I don't know how government Gov can assume that these third world country governments will build extensive transport systems and etc. to encourage MNCs by saying now they have the incentive to build all of these, without telling us why these governments suddenly have the incentive anyway. Because if they were so altruistic in the first place, then they would have done it either ways, but clearly they haven't done it yet because number one, they just don't have any money. Number two, they're corrupt. But number three, if the incentives are the profits, then it's unclear as to why they wouldn't just build these so-called limited like infrastructural systems that PM says that they will build, right? So if there is no incentive as to why they will be far more altruistic than the MNCs themselves. Lastly, then let's talk about development in two ways, right? Number one, they say that these MNCs will then invest into areas where there's already good structures, for example, like good infrastructure, good transportation. I think that's not entirely the point of this debate, right? Because the point is that if you have the capacity to develop already, you're already in good hands, you're already wealthy to a certain level, people already have a base standard of living. These are not the most pressing issues. What is most important is for the untapped markets for the MNCs to enter, and it's only the low standards and the low global minimum tax rates that allows them to enter there. But secondly, even if these host countries like LEDCs like take all the money, right? We assume their best case of government that like Myanmar, like Indonesia, all of these developing nations take all of the tax revenue. It's still unclear as to why they would be put to good use, right? We told you third world countries are corrupted, bureaucratic, inefficient. They don't actually help the people. Before I go on, I'll take the point.
Yeah, so
Oh,
literally, literally labor laws and environmental laws already have global minimum standards, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Copenhagen Declaration. Why is corporate tax different in the global minimum standard setting?
Yeah, you can say that there is a global standard, but still clearly that doesn't exist, right? MNCs still go to developing nations and they still work their people over time. They still, for example, in Vietnam and etc., work their people over time and don't pay them. All of these things still happen in the status quo, right? So it doesn't matter what you say, like principally, they say you should have a $15 minimum like wage. Clearly that doesn't happen, but also your standards are far too low internationally, right? Like clearly most nations don't have the kind of high minimum wage for people to actually live a proper life. So we think they actually get far worse on your side of the house, but like, environmental regulations aren't really that universal anyway. Lastly, about how this hampers development, right? We think that even if you are able to give the money to the most functioning governmental systems, we think they don't often like put it to like good work when it comes to development, right? So if PM claims that these companies will just put all the money into the hands of shareholders, clearly that's not how it works, right? Companies are profit driven, which means they're more likely to invest into innovation and development than anyone else. Putting money in shareholders really doesn't do anything for the future of the company. Versus on your side of the house, when you have things like government systems, we think it does things like invest into the military, invest into things that don't actually materially benefit the lives of people on the ground. Like via chasing profits, we think corporations inevitably benefit the lives of people. And it's only on our side of the house that we're able to safeguard that, especially when we're debating in a context where governments are inefficient and unable to provide for the people.
Take a DLO, now let's have the GovBip
Can you hear me? Good.
audible.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I just want to ask one question. How is that a contradiction? Because sometimes countries can do stupid things because current global tax system makes them do stupid things. What we are saying is this can change. They will now not do stupid things. And we think in a world where there's globally, you've seen a game of brinksmanship play themselves to the ground, where corporations play on LEDCs on who want the promise of infrastructural development, of knowledge transfer, of business development, they continue to be preyed upon, the LEDs continue to be preyed upon by large corporations that choose to exploit the individuals on the ground based on this particular tax system as the primary consideration of everything else. Absent which, they don't get any don't get any benefits that on our side, and they also haven't engaged with a large part of the claims that we talked about. I just want to note two debating mistakes they've made on the side. Number one, there is no real counterfactual or even an understanding of what the tier system is supposed to be. Meaning to say, there's no mechanism to explain what the thing that we say is problematic is currently working. Number two, there's an assumption that technology transfers and all these like knowledge transfers things is going to work currently. And there's again, no real analysis to explain why these things currently work or why corporations don't actually exploit them based on the promise of these things rather than the actuality of these things in the first place. Absent these two particular things, it is impossible to win this debate. Three questions in this debate. Number one, how LEDCs are currently exploited. Number two, how this will change the business calculuses. And number three, how LEDCs will benefit. Number one, and I think this is the most crucial one, how are LEDCs currently exploited? We explained to you these changes on our side because Ariel explains very clearly that this will make corporations outsource more responsibly, because now that the corporate tax rate is at a universal minimum, this allows companies to look beyond that as a primary consideration as to where to next do business. I mean, exploit people. But anyway, how does this weigh over the tiered system that they so consider on their side? I think in a leader of opposition, but they never really explain. I want to make an observation here that this was completely under-mechanized under their side. We said that many LDCs, under the very same reason of wanting development, end up with crumbling economies, end up with the same bad decision making under their side, because they first compete not by infrastructural development or any other cost consideration than to just fight via tax, which means all the things that currently exist, which is just like corporations getting all the benefits of this particular reduced tax rate, is going to currently invest in the own small hub of the city, or for example, near the seaside where they actually do businesses, and also create those infrastructures within those limited spaces, which means a large part or a large chunk of those development don't actually get invested into the large cities or as a whole, or redistributed elsewhere rather than the businesses themselves. So we see many flashing office spaces over the one side of the economy, and we see slums over the other side of India, for example. And this is the reality that we really want to talk about, and we think this is problematic. What did they say? And I just want to tag the idea of no mechanisms to all the things I'm about to say. Number one, they said they will consult technocrats and allow them to advise these governments and corporations to make correct decisions. Again, they need to mechanize how this works, otherwise this like there's barely anything to explain to you how exactly these current technocrats will help you solve these particular decisions. Number two, they say corporations are not malevolent. They build companies and transfer technology. But again, this was purely asserted without explaining or even given examples of. Yes, in the textbook, that's supposed to be what happens. But time and again, we've seen that to be false. When Walmart went to India, they destroyed all other existing local companies by sheer size and scale of their businesses. And in the instance where the parliament wanted to regulate the particular businesses, they ended up cancelling their plans to come into this company in the first place, which end up creating a lot of losses for the LEDs, for example. In those particular instances, they not just lose the initial investments that they make for accommodating these businesses, they also lose a lot of businesses along the way, the local businesses, the mom and pop shops that currently get destroyed for this reason. And we think so in reality, a lot of companies currently want control and market size as their primary consideration. So there is really a disjoint in goals between governments who want development and corporations who want profits in the first place. They say that LEDCs want a low corporate tax rate, and that is unfair to them and their safety nets. Again, no explanation whatsoever to the idea of like the road mapping and all these things to explain how they can develop this particular thing. And the last thing they said is that you concede, since labor laws are currently low now, that points to the idea of regulations too. In POI, Viha tells you that the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a thing. What was their response? Their response was, yeah, you can say it exists, but actually doesn't. That is not a response at all. That is what we call imagination, and it really doesn't engage with our main claims of what exactly it is, where we already have existing measures to regulate other versions of considerations for government, for businesses, but just not the tax one. And we think the tax one is outdated. We think we need to update it. So in the two worlds, it's rather clear. We think it's a cleaner world where systems are less bad. But yes, POI.
So like if the regulations for human rights is so good, how can your prime minister still claim that there are lower cost of labor in developing nations, so you want to go and work there? Like if it's true that regulation is so good and it's uniform all over the world, then like what's the incentive to like branch out to other nations?
I mean, we can't ignore economics, right? Like there are global minimum standards of care for these labor people, but they can still set costs considerations for labor. Like that's like literally what the countries do. So the second thing is how this will change business calculuses. The first thing we talked to you about is the global minimum tax rate is going to change because of the calculuses of businesses. Number one, we tell you that it's practically good because it's huge benefits for development and well-being, and tax can be used for redistributive purposes that especially explained in Ariel. No responses whatsoever. But we explained to you how the LEDCs have now incentive to help to redistribute this, to actually develop their own economies, and we think those things are particularly important. But what's crucial here is how this will actually help the LEDCs in the third question of the benefits, for instance. We are creating a system that helps LEDCs generate more revenue and not engage in this neoliberal game of brinksmanship, where corporate tax is the primary driver of consideration for businesses. This works both ways, in two ways. Number one, this helps let large companies think of other considerations, ease of doing business and what regulations there are. but obviously they already do it now. But these things at this point are not primary considerations, which means that they ignore these things because the tax rates are lower and it's more attractive. So a global minimum tax rates will actually help to reduce considerations of tax and move it towards this particular development considerations as a primary driver. Secondly, this means that instead of playing the tax games, we incentivize LEDCs who happen to already earn the money that they use from this particular system to use the money on development, to use the money on infrastructure, so that they can therefore allow businesses to help themselves in the first place. For all these reasons, we are proud to propose.
Speaking of whip, now let's have the up whip.
All right. Am I audible?
Audible.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 crucial clarifications in this debate. The first is on how this policy is implemented, because down the bench, we heard no way on how you necessarily facilitated the adoption of this global tax. So it's true that they have the fiat to make it global, but you cannot let government bench strawman the response. The response was never that this would never work and it would never come to light. We explained that even if you had the mechanisms for wanting everyone to adopt it right now, they never specifically prove how this global body is going to enforce these forms of taxes. Because note, by virtue of their model, that if companies are going to decide that you can have 10% going to Malaysia and 5% going to Singapore, this suggests in itself that the policy requires different countries to cooperate on a shared mutual agreement. And so therefore, by virtue of this being the model, they therefore have to explain how countries were going to permanently stay within that model, even within the harms that they accuse of. The second thing to point out here is that given that this means in the long term that certain countries are not going to benefit of as much anymore, this means you drive companies and as well as countries further away from the West, because the West was initially the ones who spearheaded this policy. This global corporation tax first was suggested in the West, which means in the long term, they also get all the harms they suggest about bad regulations, about harming workers' rights, because you move these forms of countries further towards other actors like Russia and China, which do not abide by the same standards they talk about, because they no longer opt into the same agreement here. Per motion clarifications, this is also something that can be talked about in a debate. But the second is that I think government fails to engage with a model for how we prevent the worst excesses of harm. It's uncomparative for them to say these few instances, the minority where some countries set 0% global tax rates. I don't think they're able to win the debate off that. They don't prove why it's a tipping point. 3 things that receive no response. The first is that we proved a prerequisite to change. So financially empowering these smaller states, which later allows us to fight back against corporate capture, even in their best case, because the prerequisite to any of that was drawing in that investment. They don't prove why they get that. But the second thing is that if we take PM at their absolute best and say there are some comparative advantages that developing countries have, i.e. that they have like some natural resources, or they have some forms of like cheap labor, this suggests that these developing countries also have a mutual bargaining chip, which mechanizes why we can actually have negotiations to make sure we are able to get regulation, that therefore we won't set the absolute worst tax rates available, and we are able to do this smartly per their own analysis. The third is that we also talk about why we're able to have technocrats and consultancy to make good policy here. The only rebuttal we heard was that countries don't do this because they don't prove why it's going to happen. But assuming you had the massive political capital for your side to enforce a global tax rate, this also suggests that probably if these countries were so benevolent that they truly cared about the people, then they could also invest resources in making sure they had good policy. So per their own actor incentives, we are already winning this debate. But third, how about other metrics to determine where to outsource? Because DPM says now we change the metrics from low tax rates to other things like education and infrastructure. But know that this is terrible for developing nations, because in the event when the tax rate is equal globally, the deadlock breaking metric is no longer the tax rates. The metric then becomes things like richer populations, things like economies of scale, which are exclusive in first world nations. So even taking them at their best, that you shift the metrics away from the tax rate, that's actively terrible for countries that no longer have these comparative advantages built up, because the comparative advantages that developing countries have aren't already industrialized, aren't already developed. So these companies are more likely to stay in first world nations with the infrastructures already readily available for them. This proves mechanistically why we need to lower the tax rates, because it's the only way that these developing countries can survive. 3 issues then in this speech. First, on the principal engagement. Why is sovereignty important in international trade here? Because their only line of argument was that it is principally justified to have this policy because you owe an obligations to your country because they gave you infrastructure. The first thing is that you are still paying some tax under the model. So they needed to defend a blanket tax no matter what. So their principle is uncontextualized. They don't prove why it meets the minimum threshold. But second, the reverse is also true. Insofar as they may benefit you, you also benefited them by providing them with jobs and investment. So for them to hamper your ability to adequately develop was also principally unjustified. But second, on why countries should have the right to choose. They can't claim they get sovereignty as well, like letting the US get 1 or 2% of this. The reason for this is because at the top of DPM, they flagged that most countries are going to just choose the maximum tax rate anyway, so they can get all the money. So probably you don't have the ability to claim sovereignty, so it undercuts their own argument. Our argument here isn't that how much money you can make out of that 15%. Our argument was that at least you're able to make it 7% now, and this makes it cheaper for other countries to invest. You lose that sovereignty because now this global tax rate says you must do this and you can't set any other rates, which means companies are more likely to be turned away from you. Second argument of developing countries. Note that these economically developed countries, developing countries, already have an express preference for keeping tax rates low. What this means is that when you cannot attract MNCs on the basis of tax rate, they will loosen things like labor regulation, things like environmental regulation. The only response here was that there are already global buy-in towards like different agreements to prevent things like human rights abuses. But their side says we are using imagination. But probably that isn't true because per their own analysis, there already are massive labor law regulations then. All of these things happen behind a smoke screen. They are pushed underground, which means it's far harder for global people to actually regulate what happens in developing countries. So that's why you allow companies to get away with abuses here. So if their metric is social harm, these are all way more harmful because it directly creates negative social externalities when companies are able to pollute the environment, are able to massively underpay workers and create egregious conditions then. But second, there was no response to the argument about localized production, which is damaging for their case. Because firstly, all the comparative advantages about saving on labor costs because labor is cheaper are now offsetted by the fact that you had to pay higher tax rates. So if we take their model at their best, it was a permanent reduction in your profits. So you no longer have an incentive to invest abroad because localized production in first world nations were cheaper because you now save on transport costs. You don't have to transport between different nations globally. You also save on labor costs because they are local workers as well. The weighing here is clear. Two things. The first is that we come analytically prior to them because it doesn't matter if these governments can somehow make more money in the long term because from the very start, no MNCs want to invest in you. So we break this deadlock by proving that the only thing that's here is contingent upon wanting to make those MNCs go there, which they aren't able to prove on their side. But second, this all net harms far more people. You get massive capital outflow from developing countries that weakens your currency and leaves thousands unemployed when they pull out. But thirdly, on welfare, why don't they solve their problem here? The first is that with their argument from PM that governments will be equal in providing infrastructure to different regions. But the first is that many governments are also equally corrupt, so it's a wash. For example, they're more likely to provide infrastructure to more important voting districts. But second, you can have efficiency of letting MNCs do it in richer areas, and then per their own analysis, you can have the governments do it in poorer areas as well. So we are able to like offload this responsibility so each individual actor can do it more efficiently. This engages on their best case about welfare. But finally, why don't they solve their problem? Because note that there's no incentive for governments to want to do this as well. So they can still funnel the money into a bunch of other things. They can funnel it into the military. It's unclear why all of it goes towards social welfare. So if these local governments were so incompetent in making decisions about tax rates, it's unclear per their own characterization why they will do this smartly. For all these reasons, you have to oppose. We take this debate.
Thank you, Opip. Now let's have the opposition reply.
Just to check, am I audible?
You're audible.
Okay, great. Okay, starting my reply in 3, 2, 1. The problem that plagued developing countries was never a misallocation of resources, but rather was a question of how can we generate enough wealth to sustain development within these countries so eventually one day we will be able to match the production levels of first world nations. Two strategic mistakes that cost government a debate. One, they built their whole case on the characterization of a malevolent MNC actor existing as the oppressor under the side of opposition, yet assuming that this was the very same actor which existed under the proposition's world, they gave to you no reason as to why they would suddenly pivot to become a benevolent one. Whenever they tell you that you make other considerations now at the forefront of the MNC, I think this is just convenient language for saying that now MNCs are going to resort to finding out how they can pressure developing countries into like cutting down on labor regulation or how to make their raw materials cheaper so that they can lower costs of production. Moving into two issues within this reply. Number one, is the global minimum tax rate legitimate and should we support it or not? And secondly, were developing countries enabled to get greater levels of economic activity? Onto the first issue, what exactly did government bring to you in this debate? I think their characterization of developing countries being oppressed by MNCs harmed them, because assuming that this actor was so evil under the opposition side, you needed to prove to us why by imposing the global minimum tax, this was the tipping point that changed their behavior. We told you from the get-go that power asymmetries were neutralized via allowing countries to choose what was the kind of tax rate they wanted to set. And note, whenever they attempted to co-opt choice, this was damning for the case. Two reasons here. One, this was a concession that they actually didn't get choice on their side, because when DPN outlines to you that all countries are just going to set the tax rate at 15% or even higher because they don't want to lose out, that is a concession that you didn't actually have any legitimate alternatives to rely on, which is why you were forced into a Hobson's choice. But secondly, note that if you're just forced to pay the same tax anyway, you couldn't even choose what kind of tax you wanted to set because you were going to lose anyway. In the worst case where we told you that if in fact these countries just choose to have a zero corporate tax rate, that was still legitimate, because even if it resulted in bad outcomes, at least the people will hold the government accountable because they chose to set the corporate tax. I think comparatively what we told you on the side of proposition was that when governments are able to do things like blame the global minimum tax for forcing them to do this, you worsen accountability. We flipped deregulation and the race to the bottom against them, because if it was true that corporations were so malevolent, they would pressure these very same LEDCs to deregulate via other ways. So it means that there's still going to be a harm to the environment and the people. If their metric was trying to protect developing countries from harm, I think you shackle them to the global minimum tax, reduce their options to free themselves, and you just make it worse for them. Secondly then, where developing countries are able to get greater levels of economic activity, their model of a welfare system was relying on there being the same number of MNCs operating, and this was problematic. Two reasons. One, it ignored nuance from our case, which is that a low corporate tax rate is the very thing that attracts FDI. So government can talk all they want about how this is an unfair metric and we can pivot to other things, but the things you're going to pivot to aren't any better, because if you're now going to force these MNCs to pressure LEDCs into deregulating when it comes to things like labor or the climate or the environment, these are equally as bad things, if not worse, because it's an irreversible harm. Secondly, let's just kill them on money right here, because they assume that when you increase the corporate tax rate, wow, more tax revenue, which means we can get all of our benefits. One, this assumes that the number of MNCs operating is the same on both sides. Why did we tell you that this was not the case? Because your lower cost of production via lower cost of labor is offset by the fact that you have a higher corporate tax rate, which is why we told you it made more sense to localize your production, because then you could save on things like transport costs. Because if you had to continue to pay corporate tax rate at 15% around the world, it made much better sense to stick to one country. We told you that money was essential for development, but you didn't need to put it all into the hands of the government, because even in our worst case, where these MNCs were malevolent, if they still wanted to profit, they will continue to do things like build infrastructure, because that created efficient workers. If you truly wanted the best form of development for developing countries and truly allowed them to prosper, then it was only reasonable to side with the opposition. Thank you.
Thank you of reply, and now to wrap up the round, inviting Gov reply.
Hi, am I audible?
Audible.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Opposition spends so much time of this debate trying to challenge our fiat, and I'm so confused about why the wording of the motion is so difficult to understand. This House supports the adoption, means this House supports that countries and companies will choose to adopt this themselves, no? English language 101? Like, so all of this discussion about how we enforce, how we make clear, how we, like, it's just not the debate, right? The debate is support the adoption, support that countries and companies will choose to adopt it themselves. So let's move on from to things that are actually more relevant. Either way, a lot of up case is really an is-ought fallacy, because right now, not sacrificing their tax rate will screw them over. Therefore, forever in time to come, we should keep this metric of functioning and allow people to use their tax rates as the metric for competition. The premise of the Gov case has literally been about how we should change these metrics for competition between LEDCs and make them compete on other things. So this debate has come down to what are these other metrics and are they better methods of competition compared to corporate tax rates? On government, we told you the alternative would be infrastructure, employment rates, development. This is where money will be spent instead of giving away tax revenue and on selling and campaigning. So for instance, some American cities spent up to $2 million on their campaign to attract the Amazon second headquarter and promised 0% tax rate and 0% corporate tax rate for it. That's just bad money spending priorities where they have the money but they're spending it poorly. So now when they don't have to do this method of attracting people based on tax rate, they will spend the money on creating development and infrastructure instead. On opposition, they say, but now they will compete on deregulation instead. There is going to be labor laws, environmental law, deregulation to compete for it. But there are major global limits on this. It's easy for them to just say, global regulation doesn't work. But literally, WLO proposals are what has shaped industry investment in natural resource extraction in the last 10 years. It is super trendy in debating to run the UN is bad, they are bad at regulating argument, but they actually do a lot of good work and have a pretty high success rate within economics. The low success rates in social things, sure, but it is getting significantly better and there are global standards for a lot of things. Op thinks it's a gotcha when they say, you said labor costs are low in LEDCs. Gotcha, global regulations don't work, ha ha ha. Labor costs are low because of the cost of living in those countries. The currency exchange rate and all of those things are the things that make the difference. It's why Singaporeans still drive into JB to fill petrol in our cars, even though the salaries we get in middle income jobs are about the same in both countries, because the currency exchange rate is 3:1 SGD to ringgit. This means that all of their localization argument makes zero sense in reality, because cost of living and currency rates are always going to be lower in LEDCs and therefore more affordable to companies. Plus, the existence of natural resource rates and all of these things means that MNCs will always have an interest and incentive to go into these countries because it will be cheaper for them. Yes, they will have to pay more by corporate tax rate, but they will make it up from having to pay less in terms of salaries in these other countries compared to in local countries. Why will our methods of competition be the ones that are more likely? This is my substantive in second that got no response in the debate, because it's about shifting priorities and mindsets of developed countries and how their participation in the regulation and enforcement of this is what makes the difference. Status quo is where developed countries don't think about what their obligation and duty is in how their MNCs behave when they are overseas. This policy gives home countries responsibility over the tax rates that are set in the companies that go into other countries. The only other thing opposition then ran is, but LEDCs won't be able to do this effectively because they are all bad at governing, corrupt, and are unlikely to be able to effectively put in welfare and development. But this is a huge contradiction to everything they stand for in opposition, right? Because they said that LEDCs are smart and reasonable about choosing their own tax rates that benefit them, they have sovereign choice, that they should have the ability to determine what is best for their people. If all of these principles are true about what these LEDCs should be able to do, then they're also not corrupt. They're also not supposed to be able to be bad at governing, right? They can't have it both ways. Corporations are not benevolent on our side. They are just more regulated and have their hands tied. Corporations are absolutely evil. If there wasn't a global law and expectation against torture for profit, 100% corporations would be torturing employees. This is why we set global standards to protect people against the evilness of companies. Op is the side that lets them run free to get profit. Gov protects the people.
Thank you, Go Reply, and also thanks to all our speakers for this round. Congratulations for the very engaging round. You may now virtually cross the house. However, we would like to ask you to return. Well, first we will have to close the recording first, of course. And